Good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Rangeland Fire Protection Associations in Oregon and Idaho, Implications for Fire Adaptation and Agency Community Relationships, presented by Emily Jane Davis with Oregon State University and Jesse Abrams with the University of Oregon. Before I introduce our presenters, I will go over some webinar details. If you have questions or comments for the speakers or me, please type them into the questions window of your control panel located at the top right of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will field your questions for the speakers after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio window and check your audio selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenters. Emily Jane Davis is an assistant professor and extension specialist with Oregon State University, located in the Dalles, Oregon. Her work focuses on natural resource collaboration, including wildfire-related collaboration and partnerships. Her current projects include research and technical assistance on all lands projects, national forest collaboratives, and co-management of wildfire risk. Jesse Abrams is a research associate with the Ecosystem Workforce Program, part of the Institute for a Sustainable Environment at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon. He has been studying the social and political dimensions of wildfire and restoration in Western landscapes for over a decade. His areas of specialty include community-based natural resource management and social ecological system resilience. Welcome, Emily Jane and Jesse, and thanks for presenting today.
Thank you.
All right, now, Emily Jane, I'm going to make you the presenter. Great, we see your outline. Perfect.
Great, and so I'll go ahead and get started, and then Emily Jane and I are going to kind of switch back and forth as presenters over the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. And so you can see our outline here. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on Emily Jane and myself and on our research project. We're going to talk about fire in these rangeland ecosystems and then go into the structure and policy behind RFPAs, which are the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations that we'll be talking about today. And then we'll go into our framework and methods for the research project we'll be talking about, then discuss some key findings and challenges from the research, and then talk about implications of the RFPA model for fire-adapted communities more broadly. And of course, at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. And so the point of this presentation is to discuss Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, what we'll be calling RFPAs throughout the rest of the presentation, which are these all-volunteer wild and fire response crews composed of ranchers that respond to fires on private state land and often on federal lands as well in remote landscapes, rangeland landscapes. And so as you can see here on the slide, these are voluntary associations. They operate in places where state or rural fire protection is lacking, and they receive support in the sense of training, equipment, and in some cases funding, often pass-through funding, from state agencies. And so we're going to be talking about the RFPA programs in Oregon and Idaho today. And so the relevant state agencies there are the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Idaho Department of Lands. And in general, the RFPAs will participate both in initial attack and in some cases beyond, and are built on this concept of neighbors helping neighbors. And so the background here, this all comes out of a research project that Emily Jane Davis and I are involved in called Fire Adapted Communities on the Range, Alternative Models of Wildfire Response. And Emily Jane is the PI, the principal investigator. I'm the co-PI along with Jim Meacham from the University of Oregon Infographics Laboratory. And we've had the support of others on the team, including Kathleen Wallstein, currently a PhD student at University of Idaho, as well as the infographics team at University of Oregon, Alethea Stein-Gisser and Dylan Molnar, and Lee Cerveny from the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. And we want to acknowledge that this is a joint fire science program funded project, and we've received their support as well as obviously the support of everyone who's participated as research participants in our work. And as Ginny mentioned, both Emily Jane and I have backgrounds in community-based resource management, and so we were intrigued when we began hearing about RFPAs a few years ago. Particularly, some of these RFPAs in Oregon were starting to make headlines for their role in battling some major range fires. The Long Draw and Miller Homestead fires in 2012 were particular examples of that. And so we decided to investigate this model and try to understand its advantages and challenges. And so as you can see here, our research objectives in this project were to analyze the RFPA model in terms of its design and its effectiveness, to look at capacities and values at risk across these remote landscapes, and to develop conceptual models and hypotheses regarding this notion of community-based wildfire response. And now I'll turn over to Emily Jane for the next few slides.
Great, thank you, Jesse. So again, I'm Emily Jane Davis from Oregon State University, and I'll start with providing us some background on fire concerns that we have in rangeland landscapes, the context that we're in. Many of you are probably very familiar with this, living and working in these landscapes. And you probably know that the historic mean fire return intervals on these sagebrush steppe ecosystems vary from a couple of decades to over a century, depending on the elevation and precipitation in those areas. You probably also know that the incidence and size of rangeland fires has been increasing in recent years, hundreds of thousands of acres in single fire events. Invasive annuals and grasses can really contribute to changes in the fire regime. And fire, along with those invasive species, are considered the greatest threats to greater sage grouse throughout much of its range, including in the Northwest. You know, this context of the range fires is really important because they become large very quickly. The 2012 Long Draw fire down in southeastern Oregon reached over 550,000 acres. The cross-boundary Oregon and Idaho soda fire of 2015 reached nearly 280,000 acres, meaning that it's important to try to contain starts when they're small in order to reduce the spatially extensive impacts that are possible on, you know, forage, livestock, livelihoods, species like sage grouse, etc. And then an additional social context has been social and political challenges around fire management, federal fire management in recent years, reflecting the larger tensions that exist between resource users and the land management agencies. For ranchers, challenges include forage being consumed, threats to their livestock, and the limitations on grazing for 2 years following a burn. So it's a very weighty and important topic. And this map just shows the context for that sage grouse habitat that I just mentioned. The Great Basin is home, obviously, to much of the current habitat where this is happening and where there are a lot of voluntary efforts underway to conserve sage grouse. And this map shows another context of the RFPAs really well. These are two of the different RFPAs that we studied. And a complex issue in these landscapes is that they're very intermixed between ownerships. So you'll have BLM, Forest Service, other federal agencies, state land, private land, sometimes reservations, often intermixed. And as we know, fire does not respect boundaries and will cross those boundaries. So how do RFPAs operate given these complex jurisdictional and physical landscapes? What allows them to respond to fire? Well, in each state, and I should add here that there is a growing RFPA program in Nevada, and they're starting up in other states, but our project focuses just on the Oregon and Idaho programs since it started a few years ago. In each state, the statutory authority for RFPAs comes from the state, and they are authorized and organized by state governments. In Oregon, that authority is established under Chapter 477 of the Oregon Revised Statutes, which is Fire Protection of Forests and Vegetation. In Idaho, they are authorized under Title 38 of Idaho Statutes, Forestry, Forest Products, and Stumpage Districts. What both of these legal frameworks allow It allows for rangeland landowners to voluntarily form RFPAs as registered nonprofit associations, organizations in areas that lack state or existing rural fire protection, as Jesse said, and to protect the private and state-owned land within those boundaries. The states have also defined rights and responsibilities for RFPAs, including minimum standards for training, protection from liability when conducting fire suppression operations, and we'll talk a little more about how those differ by state coming up. In addition to those authorities and roles, state government and funds also contribute in several ways to RFPA capacity. State agencies serve as a pass-through for both state and federal grants and equipment so that they can receive heavy equipment for fire suppression. A lot of this has come from sage-grouse funding. There can be provision or access to personal protective equipment, radios, and other needs for fire suppression. And then the training. In Oregon, the training has taken place with ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry, over the past, over its history. But increasingly, it's also been with the Bureau of Land Management in the past few years. And in Idaho, it has always been with the Bureau of Land Management. But in order for the RFPAs to respond and engage on federal lands, there's a need for other agreements and arrangements. So agencies that they might be working with, Bureau of Land Management or Fish and Wildlife, where you have wildlife refuges, they require these separate means to work with RFPAs. In Idaho, the cooperative agreements are used, and in Oregon, memoranda of understanding. These differ, but both of them have the effect of allowing each individual RFPA to cooperate on fire protection on federal lands, and then they detail considerations such as fire response procedures, communications protocols, and standards to be followed. The BLM also has provided training, as I noted, particularly in the Idaho context, and some equipment. And RFPAs are also being recognized by the federal government at larger scales in larger nationwide rangeland fire management strategies, like the Secretary of the Interior's order in 2015, and then in the subsequent integrated rangeland fire management strategy. And finally, but very important, RFPA members contribute significant resources of their own. They operate on the basis of volunteer labor when it comes down to it. They use their private resources, trucks, dozers, water sources that are owned by themselves or their neighbors. Their operating budget comes from the annual dues paid by participating members and what people want to put in. And then really just a lot of time and energy that obviously is taken away from time when they would be working on their operations. A little bit of history and current status on each RFPA program. They have fairly different histories. In Oregon, the first RFPA was established in 1964, although there were not that many. The biggest increase in them occurred in the 90s and 2000s. And as of 2017, there were a total of 22 distinct RFPAs established across eastern Oregon, covering 14 million acres of land. Idaho's RFPA program was established more recently in 2013, and as of this year, there are 9 established RFPAs covering 7 million acres of land. And then, as I noted, the Nevada program is much more recent, established in 2015. We did not study it. And many of these RFPAs, they haven't necessarily been around for that long, just a few years, but they have seen a lot of action since their inception. Some of the large fires that have seen RFPA response include the Long Draw and Soda that I mentioned earlier, Buzzard Complex, Pony Elk Complex, and Owyhee Canyon. Just to give you a sense of our research, because this was a social science project, our research goals, as Jesse noted, were to analyze the structure and effectiveness of the RFPA model. We developed a research proposal to Joint Fire Science several years ago, seeking advance input from Oregon Department of Forestry, Idaho Department of Lands, BLM, and some RFPA folks we connected with. We gathered available documentation on RFPAs, including those legal and policy contexts, organizational documents, reports in media about the fires RFPAs were involved in. And then we chose a case study approach to get at this. A case study approach allows researchers to more deeply understand a particular phenomenon in its context and through the lens of those closest to it. And it can work well in remote and rural landscapes where there's not a lot of secondary data, and in order to come in and be able to interview people and really understand what goes on, you need to be able to talk to them and talk to them in some depth. We chose 4 case studies of RFPAs in Oregon, 2 in Oregon and 2 in Idaho. These are the Crane, Jordan Valley, Owyhee, and Mountain Home RFPAs. We chose these RFPAs because they had some longer history of existence. They covered very large landscapes, and they had relatively recent experience with large fires. We conducted interviews with ranchers and BLM in these areas, asking them a series of structured questions about their history, experience with fire, relationship with federal fire managers, development over time. And we also interviewed the state and federal managers who work overall with RFPAs in each state. We interviewed a total of 63 participants across the states. For mapping, during these interviews, we also asked our interviewee participants to indicate where they saw values and risks across their respective landscapes by marking up paper maps that we later digitized. We analyzed all this data, and we presented the preliminary results over the past year at 2 state-level RFPA meetings in each state and obtained feedback, which has helped us calibrate what we've shared with you today and get a reality check. This map shows the location of our case study areas in southeastern Oregon and southwestern Idaho. These are somewhat relatively proximate physically, meaning they have some similar landscapes, terrain, cultures, and types of fire, although each RFPA does have its own unique circumstances. For example, there are differences in the Oregon-Idaho RFPA model that we will talk about, even though those 2, Jordan Valley and Owyhee, are right next to each other. Or for another example, Mountain Home's adjacency to a major interstate adds complexity to some of the fire starts and suppression operations. I'm going to turn it back over to Jesse now to get into some of our research findings.
Great, thanks, Emily Jane. So before getting into the findings, I'm going to briefly talk about our theoretical framework. We framed this research around the concepts of institutional design and community-based natural resource management. And before starting the research, we recognized pretty early on this potential for tensions between these 2 different communities of practice, one being the sort of the highly formalized, highly structured institutions associated with the federal agencies and the professional fire responders, and on the other hand, the more informal institutions and informal relationships that are characteristic of rural communities. And so we're interested to see how these tensions or these potential tensions were managed and how the design of state RFPA programs influenced those relationships. We also recognize that the RFPA model, or models as the case may be, represented a real departure from the predominant fire protection model across much of the U.S. in the sense that in most places where you have human communities, the residents don't have authority to participate in fire response, and their primary responsibility is sort of maintaining a fire-safe home environment and then getting out of the way when a fire approaches. And so we wanted to explore this notion of the RFPA model as an alternative to that and to see what sort of lessons it might hold for this broader question of community fire adaptation. And so we think there are lessons here for WUI communities that are maybe quite different from these remote rangeland communities, but still may be able to take some lessons from the RFPA model. So we're going to go into just a few key findings here from our research. The first here being that we feel that ranchers really possess some important advantages for fire response, and this came out pretty consistently throughout our work and our analysis. And there are a few key points that I'll talk about here. One is quite simply just their distribution across the landscape, which stands in contrast to the professional federal fire responders who tend to be concentrated in specific fire stations. And so you have these very large landscapes, you have fire starting in quite remote areas, and that can get big quickly. And so this idea of having people kind of distributed across the landscape who are able to move quickly to these fire starts and catch them while they're small is a huge advantage. Secondly, this notion of local knowledge came out as an important theme throughout our research. And that's the idea that the ranchers who participate in these RFPAs, they know the terrain very well. They have an intimate knowledge of the landscape and landscape processes. And that gives them advantages in terms of accessing fires, knowing where to tie in, knowing where some natural fire breaks might be. And those could be areas that have been grazed. They might be areas where there's, let's say, sort of a lava field that's unlikely to burn. They know where water sources are. So it's some of that local knowledge and access to local resources that the professional firefighters may not have. And so there's various ways in which this local knowledge has been put into use, including communication with the agency fire managers, as well as through direct application by RFPA members on the fire line. And the establishment of RFPAs as these formal institutions appears to have created an opportunity to apply this local knowledge. So in other words, there may have been some interest on the part of the professional firefighters in using that local knowledge prior to the RFPA establishment, but they were essentially precluded from using it, from accessing it. And so this model created some avenues to actually integrate that local knowledge into firefighting. And so things such as the creation of the RFPAs, their recognition through the agreements and the MOUs, and their activities on the fire line have provided them with some presence and visibility and these avenues to apply that local knowledge. A third point, and somewhat an obvious point, is that there's a very strong motivation to respond to fires on the part of the RFPA members, given that they have livestock, forage, potentially structures, fencing, et cetera, at risk from wildfire. They have a very direct livelihood motivation to get out there and keep those fires small. And then a fourth point that again was quite consistent across our case studies was this notion of the RFPA members being quite creative in how they dealt with some of the challenges of these remote landscapes. And so a couple of examples of this are the sometimes limited communications infrastructure in remote areas. And so even some of the BLM or the professional federal firefighting agencies' communication equipment doesn't always work that well in some of the more remote parts of these landscapes. And this is an issue that the ranchers have been dealing with for years. And so in many cases, they've developed their own systems that include some combination of private ranch radios with private repeaters, cell phones, landlines. And so they're actually able to sort of cobble together a working communication system in some of these remote landscapes that they were then able to leverage for use on the fire line. Another example of this was in some of our cases, we saw RFPA members staffing their own sort of private lookouts when thunderstorms were approaching, and then responding quickly to those fire starts as they came in at the same time that they were radioing those fire starts to the BLM. And so you have this sort of the RFPA members acting both as lookouts, as the fire responders, and helping to relay that to BLM dispatch. And so we saw that all of these things were sort of these incipient advantages of involving ranchers in fire response that were only able to be leveraged once that RFPA organization was formally established. So a second key finding here is that we found that the establishment of these RFPAs had some effects in changing the relationships between ranchers and those federal fire managers. In general, the overall trend, it's certainly not in all cases, but in many cases, this was a trend towards more constructive relationships over time. And in part, this reflects the RFPA status as formal, the sort of formal recognition as cooperators or partners on the fire line. And in part, it reflects some earned respect from their activities on the fire line, and in part, it actually reflects these strengthened informal relationships off the fire line. So this sort of kind of bonding, you might say, between the federal firefighters and the RFPA members that happened maybe after a fire or in the community. And so this, we felt again that our findings were fairly clear in that without that RFPA structure, some of those relationships and some of those changes would have been unlikely to occur. And so we found that this actually increased rancher standing as fire managers and also helped them to understand why the federal firefighters took the actions they did, why they used the strategies they did on the fire line. A third key finding here is that there were relatively subtle distinctions in the design of the Idaho and Oregon RFPA models, but that those subtle distinctions led to some substantial outcomes, some different outcomes. And so the basic difference here is that the Oregon model is fundamentally built upon this notion of a rights-based framework. It's built upon the idea that property owners have the right to defend their property from wildfire. And so that's different from the Idaho model, in which is really built upon the idea that ranchers' participation in firefighting is a privilege. And so that's the idea is that in Idaho, all that participation has to comply with the sort of federal fire cooperator standards, whereas in Oregon, it's much more based on the idea of sort of protection of private property. And this matters because many RFPA members, particularly in Oregon, saw themselves as having defensible property interests even on federal land, so meaning their livestock, forage, fencing, etc., and therefore they often felt that they had a right to defend those interests whether or not they were in conformity with those federal cooperator standards. In both cases, in both Oregon and Idaho, the state played a mediating role, but with different details in each case. And so in Oregon, the state essentially supported the rights of those ranchers, those property owners, to defend their property. So they were primarily a supporting role, not a regulating role. In Idaho, the state played more of a supporting and regulating role in ensuring that those RFPAs were meeting the federal cooperator standards. And so in general, we found that there were some patterns here, some patterns of difference between the two states. In general, some higher levels of conflict on the Oregon side, particularly regarding such things as fire training, communications protocols, and the use of personal protective equipment. But we should say that has been changing over time, and I think probably the last year or two has seen some changes in the Oregon model, where they're moving a little bit more towards the Idaho model. There's still some distinctions there, but some of those conflicts really came to a head within the last year and seem to have started to be ironed out, sort of in cooperation between the federal agencies, the state, and the RFPA members. In general, we found that Oregon was also more aggressive in acquiring federal surplus equipment than the Idaho agencies were, and sort of leading to this idea that on the Idaho side, there was a more consistent training but less access to equipment. On the Oregon side, more access to equipment but less consistent training. In general, we also found that on the Oregon side, RFPA members saw their roles more expansively than the RFPA members did on the Idaho side. Our Idaho RFPA members in general saw themselves primarily limited to that initial attack and then handing it off to the BLM firefighters. Whereas in Oregon, they saw themselves as playing a more expansive role both spatially and temporally. And so you can see here that last slide just sort of illustrates some of those differences between the two frameworks. Our last finding here that I'll talk about here is that the RFPA model is really built around suppression needs. It's focused on suppression, and that's sort of its structure, but potential exists to leverage the RFPA structure for a wider range of fire adaptive activities. And so we'll show a slide here in a moment that shows the outline of the Paradigm project, which is, I think, one of the best examples of that we found. This is a project on the Mountain Home, or near the Mountain Home RFPA district in Idaho, that involves construction of fuel breaks across both private and public lands. And so this idea of having a framework to work cooperatively across those land ownership boundaries was, in this case, very much facilitated by the presence of the RFPA. There was interest in a lot of our interviewees, a lot of our RFPA interviewees in participating in prescribed fire. Right now, legal barriers in terms of the training required to apply prescribed fire on federal land prevents them from playing an active role on the federal estate, but they're still, in many cases, quite active on private and state lands in applying prescribed fire. And so in 2016, there were 7 RFPAs in Oregon that did some kind of prescribed fire activity, resulting in over 5,600 acres burned, the majority of that being a single RFPA district, the Ashwood Antelope RFPA. And we found at least one case, and we suspect that there are probably others, where ranchers had historically used fire to manage rangelands and were essentially forced to stop that activity over time by the federal agencies. And so we've hypothesized, and this is not something we've looked into extensively, but we hypothesized that there may actually be quite a bit of interest in that notion of using fire as a management tool on the part of RFPA members. And again, the RFPA model could be a way of leveraging that interest into some kind of a structured program of work applying prescribed fire. So now I'm going to talk briefly about, this is the paradigm project that I just mentioned. So you can see the outline there, plus a lot of the key fire breaks. This is that area in the Mountain Home RFPA district that Emily Jane mentioned, right along Interstate 84, where there's just a lot of complications related to a large number of ignition sources, a lot of cheatgrass, and a lot of other values at risk beyond the rangeland that prevents often a focus on those rangeland resources when a fire does break out. So some of the key challenges I'll talk about here briefly. The first one here being this notion of integrating these two distinct models of practice, and that's the idea I mentioned a moment ago of the formal versus the informal, the highly structured institutions and kind of those rules of practice on the sides of the agency and the professional firefighters versus the much more informal and community-based models within these remote rural rangeland communities. And this also relates to things like learning by doing, the more practical knowledge that you associate with the rural residents and the ranchers versus the more formal training, formal expertise you get on the part of the professionals. Also this notion of being very rule-bound versus being very flexible. And so obviously when you're talking about wildfire response, there's a lot of need to be very clear about expectations, clear about roles. And so this notion of integrating these two different models of practice is an ongoing challenge. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we found that these challenges were heavier, were more pronounced in Oregon. But as I also mentioned, those have been changing over time, and to some extent, the tensions, I think, have been slowly being addressed by some of these more recent changes to things like the MOUs that the RFPAs in Oregon work under. Let me just go back to that last slide for a second before we move on. We did feel that there were some adaptation and some opportunities to resolve those tensions over time, and part of that has to do with sort of repeated experiences of working in the fields, working on the fire line together. And so we found that in many cases there's sort of a process of co-adaptation where the RFPA members were able to better understand and better work with the professional firefighters as well as vice versa. The BLM firefighters were able to better understand the sort of the motivations and the skills of the RFPA members and work more constructively with them over time. Second challenge here is communication and recognition. And so some of the issues that came up here had to do with things like the use of personal protective equipment, including PPE that would clearly identify someone as being part of a fire response team. And so particularly, again, on the Oregon side, where there were some RFPAs that were initially hesitant to follow the guidance of consistently wearing PPE on the fire line, this led to some confusion in some cases as to whether or not someone was a part of an RFPA, whether they were authorized to be on the fire line, whether they were in communication with the rest of the fire team. And so there's sort of this concern about a sort of a rogue rancher who maybe wasn't part of the RFPA, or even an RFPA member who wasn't kind of participating in the overall communication protocol, being in the wrong place at the wrong time on a fire. And so this is an issue that was primarily came up on the Oregon side with some of the RFPAs that were pushing back against the insistence that they comply with the federal PPE requirement. But that requirement has been, that sort of issue has been somewhat resolved over time as the RFPAs have agreed to more consistently wear and use PPE on the fire line. Another challenge that came up consistently, this is both on the Oregon and Idaho side, is we heard a lot of stories about the transition to a Type 1 or Type 2 incident management team. And so we found that in general, the RFPAs that we studied had good working relationships with their local BLM district, and they had kind of come to a good understanding of how to work constructively on the fire line. When a fire gets big and a national team is brought in, a Type 1 or Type 2 team, many cases those teams don't understand RFPAs. They may not even recognize what they are or their role in the fire line. And so there were cases where that team didn't recognize the RFPAs as being part of the fire response team, or in some cases even keeping them out of radio contact, I don't think intentionally, but because they weren't aware that they should be communicating with and sort of keeping the RFPA members in the loop as far as changes to things like radio frequencies. And so this is an issue that's been recognized both by the RFPA members and by the federal professionals, and again, they have taken some steps to address this issue. But it is a problem knowing that right now only a handful of states actually have RFPA programs. So when you have Type 1 or Type 2 teams from other parts of the country, they may not have any idea what an RFPA is, much less how to work with them. And so Emily Jane's going to conclude and talk about some of the best practices from here.
Great, thank you, Jesse. We're going to conclude here with two sets of implications. One is lessons learned for thinking about RFPA programs specifically, what might apply to them, followed by lessons learned from the RFPA model that might apply to fire adaptation and response efforts more broadly. The first is obviously the interface between RFPAs and the BLM is a really important dimension of this. And we saw that where this worked well and where the agency staff and community partners could be better engaged together, this would be enhanced by time spent together, not just during the stress of a fire event, but off the fire line, particularly during trainings, learning some of the same things at the same time, getting to ask questions, and social events like barbecues, beginning and end of the season, as well as just seeing each other in the community and being members of the same community. It was also the case that in instances where the local BLM staff were members of that community themselves for a long time, or perhaps from a ranching background, even if they were not from that community, that we saw more positive relationships. During fire events, ride-alongs and sort of just experience gained during the fires, which Jesse mentioned, really helped build mutual understanding. So why were certain federal tactics and strategies being used, and growing appreciation of rancher knowledge, so on both sides. And then finally, when the incident management teams came in externally, as Jesse just mentioned, local BLM serving as liaisons. So explaining to the federal teams, these are who RFPAs are, this is why they're important, here's how we're working with them, can really help ease the involvement when non-local personnel are coming in. And we spent a lot of time talking about this, and it's really the point that RFPA program design is fairly influential in the outcomes for rancher and BLM relationships. Although the differences between Idaho and Oregon programs seem relatively subtle on paper, as you heard, we consistently saw differences in how these played out in the two states, particularly around the level of tensions that were there, the interest of members in going outside their local area to fires and staying on fires beyond initial attack, in the access and use of federal surplus equipment and grants. And so I think that for other states that are looking at establishing an RFPA program, or for those existing that may want to revise their programs, those design features are just something to consider because of the implications they may have. We also did a little thinking about the RFPAs as organizations themselves. They are, as I said, registered nonprofit organizations. They have to have boards. They have to meet regularly. They're an institution that helps organize rancher response on fires. RFPAs that are well organized seem to have some of the following characteristics. Leadership, so the presence of a willing chairperson or other leader who is willing to do the organizational and administrative work, kind of be the caretaker of the RFPA, and also importantly really set the tone for and mediate relationships with the BLM. Although we only studied 4 cases, the presence of this leadership was pretty significant in each. We also saw that it was important for RFPAs to be just well organized administratively, so have and maintain good systems for tracking finances, in-kind, training, etc., and having their books in order. And then related to the question of organizational capacity, if RFPAs in the future ever do engage beyond just suppression and in a range of possibly mitigation activities, they are nonprofit organizations, and there are agency structures and processes for partnering with nonprofit organizations. So this may make it easier to figure out all the authority and liability issues, to have them work on beyond just suppression. And then finally, we have a couple more implications, as I said, for community wildfire adaptation more broadly. The first is that rural residents may be much more motivated to play substantive roles in wildfire governance than current practice and reality and policy really supports. As Jesse noted at the beginning, in general, the residents of a wildland-urban interface community are asked to do little more than prepare their immediate home environment and be ready to get out of the way when fire comes. There are increasingly local collaborative groups and organizations that might have collaborative dialogue about planned fuels reduction projects, but they are also not typically part of suppression. And that there are obvious safety and other reasons for this. However, the case of RFPAs demonstrates that some residents want and expect to play more active roles in fire preparation and response. And this is likely to be particularly true in what our colleague Travis Pavelio has called the working lands communities, those that are characterized by a long-term multi-generational residence on the land, and economic and cultural attachment to traditional natural resource livelihoods, and where there is a lot of local skill and knowledge in those places. Second, we talked about this throughout, but the creation of increased authority and responsibility fosters learning and adaptation and improves situation over time. We found that the RFPA members adapted in several ways as they went through the process of taking responsibility for fire response. They learned tactics, but they also gained a broad understanding of the justification for those tactics, and they were able to incorporate their local knowledge and institutions. At the same time, professional firefighters, in some cases, many cases, have adapted to working with RFPAs even when it was uncomfortable at first or outside of their norm, and now see them as invaluable assets. So this suggests that residents and agencies and other communities may be also able to adapt and learn over time, even if they start out with some conflict or community members are starting out with relatively limited understandings of fire management. It's evident that local knowledge and institutions are valuable assets that improve fire preparedness and response, but they also do pose challenges to integration with professional, formal, federal institutions. So that local knowledge, the terrain knowledge, how to access, what conditions are the roads in, and institutions like the reciprocal altruism and the institutionalization of surveillance and communication that RFP members had were some of the most valuable assets for fire response. And these resources likely exist, as we said, throughout various rural communities and could potentially contribute more to effective fire response. But it wouldn't happen overnight. Repeated interactions between the professional agencies and residents, and a supportive framework that figures out some of the issues, such as what's provided by the state RFPA programs, would be needed to resolve the tensions between this informal knowledge and the formal knowledge in institutions. Finally, we did want to also underscore that the successes and struggles of the RFPA program can't be entirely reduced to questions of institutional design. If you put these policies in place, it'll all work out. I mean, really much of the progress that has been made has come through the strengthening of professional and interpersonal relationships between ranchers and fire managers at the one-to-one individual level. In many communities, residents have had little interaction with fire managers, don't know who they are, except in emergency situations. So greater interaction with residents both before and during fires may lead to more productive relationships and greater engagement in fire adaptation. And at the personal human level, it's that building of trust and experience that does make a substantial difference. So we wanted to thank you for your time today. Again, we wanted to thank the funder who supported this program, this project, the Joint Fire Science Program, the many interviewees who took time away from doing important work in fire suppression and ranching to participate and our partners at the University of Oregon Infographics Lab, who provided spatial analysis and support. And we welcome your questions, comments, and feedback either now, or you can reach out and get in touch with us through our email.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. How can RFPAs be involved with prescribed burns? More specifically, what are the issues and opportunities relative to prescribed burn involvement or other prescriptive activities?
Jesse, do you want to take that one, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I can hazard a response, and then Emily Jane, if you want to chime in. Essentially, our understanding is that, so right now the RFPA members in Idaho are required to complete the S-130, S-190 series of wildland fire management courses. That's not required on the Oregon side, but it's becoming institutionalized that will be a requirement in Oregon as well. That allows the RFPA members to participate in wildfire response, but that level of training is not adequate for participating in prescribed fire on federal lands. And so right now, the stock of RFPA members that can actually participate in prescribed fire on federal lands is pretty minimal. There may be a few here and there that have more advanced levels of training, but it's really not the norm. And so right now, their opportunities have really been limited to implementing prescribed fire projects on private land and on state land where those same requirements don't apply. And so, as I mentioned in one of those slides, that's already taking place. Certainly in Oregon, the Oregon RFPA program has started to track prescribed fire accomplishments as part of their annual tracking system. And as I mentioned, in 2016, there were 7 different RFPAs that did some level of prescribed fire. And primarily there was one RFPA that did quite a bit, about 4,800 acres just on one RFPA. Idaho, to our knowledge, hasn't started tracking those numbers yet, but it's quite possible that something similar is happening on the Idaho side. So that's the best answer I can give. I don't know, Emily Jane, if you wanted to chime in at all.
Right. So as Jesse mentioned, there's a training obstacle to overcome. There would also be all the obstacles we expect with prescribed fire on any landscape, wanting to make sure it's safe, wanting to make sure it does what it's intended to do, minimize the risks from using it. I would suggest that, the extent that ranchers and BLM partner to pilot prescribed burn projects on private lands where they're able to do so within a different legal and policy framework and just get some mutual learning and experience under their belts, that could help lay the groundwork as well for moving it to federal land.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, who initiates RFPAs? Is it the landowners, the federal agencies, or can either initiate establishing an RFPA?
Jesse, would you like me to start, or would you?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and I'll follow up if there's anything that needs to be added.
So the ranchers have to be willing to participate in the RFPA and willing to form the organization, the nonprofit organization, and sign those cooperating agreements. I suspect, the Mountain Home case is a good example. I would call it both rancher and BLM motivated. Both ranchers and BLM were frustrated with conflicts they had been having on fires, running into each other, getting into fights, BLM telling them to go away, ranchers not wanting to go away. And so there was a mutual frustration, and they all came together and had a meeting and talked about it. With any phenomena like this, sometimes you hear different origin stories from different people from their perspectives, like I started it, or so-and-so started it. But I think in many cases it's been both. There also needs to be work done to figure out the boundaries of the RFPA. What are the lands it's going to cover? Whose properties is it going to involve, and that kind of thing, and that has to be figured out collaboratively. But my answer would be, no one, and they can't just come up with it alone. The motivation comes from both of them. Jesse, would you add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say that one of the, I think, core concepts sort of animating the RFPA model is the idea that it's voluntary. So it's really meant to be a tool rather than sort of a regulatory process. So meaning that RFPAs are not taxing districts, they're purely operate on a volunteer basis, and even once an RFPA is established and their boundaries are established, only those landowners and residents within the boundary who want to participate in the RFPA will actually participate. So there's no obligation on the part of anyone who's not part of the RFPA to participate. So at the end of the day, it really, I think as Emily Jane said, it's often comes out of these conversations between the agencies and the ranchers, but at the end of the day, the individual ranchers or residents have to be willing to sort of commit to organizing, providing the resources, and then responding when the situation arises. And that's the case in both Oregon and Idaho. I don't know the Nevada program well at all, but I took a quick glance earlier today, and it looks like in Nevada, one difference is that the RFPA actually has to be approved by the county board in whichever county it's going to be established, which is not the case in Oregon or Idaho. There are some roles for counties in those states, but it looks like in the case of Nevada, there's actually an additional step in which the county has to approve it as well.
I would add that state government does play a bit of a role. So we've had some RFPAs in Oregon expand their boundaries. I think that Oregon Department of Forestry and Idaho Department of Lands play some role in approving like boundary changes and that kind of thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. Right. In every case, the RFPA will essentially proposed RFPA will petition to the state, and the state will approve it.
Great, thank you so much. And then one last quick question: how, in comparison with the eastern part of the country where there's a lot more private land, how do they have an? I don't know if it would be rangelands per se, but do they have sort of the public-private associations that are starting to form out here in the West? How does that work?
I guess I should answer that because I'm from a small town on the East Coast.
Yeah.
It's just so different because the population density is so much higher. So, and there aren't large areas of land that are more remote and for which there isn't suppression, there isn't fire response authority. In my town and towns around mine, we relied a lot on volunteer fire departments. It seemed like everyone in the community was kind of part of one. And those were kind of by a town basis, town or village basis. We don't have the intermix of public and private lands in the same way very much at all either. Like I'm from New Hampshire, there's just really one national forest and it's not intermixed. So and I would say the whole spatial scale is smaller too. The degree to which folks are responding is on a much spatially smaller level. And then one big difference is obviously, are you trained to do structural protection or are you also trained to do wildland protection? To my knowledge, most of the volunteer firefighters in our area really do structural protection only. And I think a state agency gets involved otherwise, but I'm not 100% sure.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Well, wonderful. Thank you everyone for your participation. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after the webinar has ended. I will post the recording of this webinar on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel this afternoon, and the link will be automatically sent to you through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. If you have further questions regarding this or future webinars, please email or call me anytime, and Emily Jane Davis and Jesse Abrams put their email addresses up here as well, so you can contact them with further questions about RFPAs and their study. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Emily Jane and Jesse, for this great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
All right, have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Bye.